Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So the reason why I've started creating videos is because I plan on drafting a lot of Modern Masters 3 that's coming out soon. I'm really excited for the format, what it looks like as a thing to draft, and I really also like the expected value of the set. I know that seems like a very weird thing to get excited about, but I'm a something of a free to play player on Magic Online. I mean, I guess not quite a free to play player because you have to spend $10 initially for the account. But for roughly the past year and a half, I've been drafting and playing constructed and doing things like that without having to put in any extra money, and have been able to accumulate a pretty good chunk of tickets and play points and stuff like that. 14 or 1,460 play points, coming up on 2,000 tickets now. Uh, lots of stuff that I've been able to get, and I've done it through focusing on expected value and focusing on basically never throwing away my money, which is a very difficult thing to do on Magic Online. It's very easy to spend money on Magic Online. It's not very easy to grow your collection on Magic Online without spending money. So I'm excited for Modern Masters for the expected value. Here's my spreadsheet just for a glance at what I kind of am guessing the expected value of a pack is going to be. The rough estimate I have right now is that for probably a $7 pack, I'm going to get maybe back $3.50 in cards. And as a general rule of thumb, anytime you're getting back half of the value of the pack in cards, you probably have a pretty good draft format for yourself there. So I'm really looking forward to it from the perspective of a free-to-play player. I'm also really looking forward to it from the perspective of a Magic player. I'm really liking the set. I think it's going to be very fun to draft, and I wanted to record my drafts of the format and record my thoughts on the format, I guess for posterity's sake, because I plan on drafting a lot of it, and I figured I might as well take the leap and start doing some recording. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about what defines a limited format. What are the factors that really push it in one direction or another towards being a slower, more control-focused format versus being a fast, aggressive format, right? What are these things that really do it? And I want to talk a little bit about past formats, and then talk about Modern Masters and kind of expectations for that set. So I've kind of given three examples on each side of fast formats and slow formats. In the fast format category, I think we have Zendikar, Gatecrash. I'm going to put Magic 2012 in there as well. And in the slower formats, I'm going to put Rise of the Eldrazi, Innistrad, and Magic 2014. And so a large part of the question is, well, what made those formats what they were, right? What made them fast or slow? What were the influencing factors, right? Because as we might know, or at least those of us who have played it, Zendikar, Gatecrash, Magic 2012 were very, very fast formats. Gatecrash and Zendikar in particular. And it really threw you for a loop if you tried to evaluate cards, because you saw a lot of great cards in, say, Gatecrash, like the Primordials, that normally, if you didn't know anything else about the format, you think these are very strong cards, right? And I should be drafting them very early. These are bombs, and they're going to win me games. And the truth was, they were complete traps in Gatecrash. If you drafted those cards and tried to play them, people were going to laugh and point at you, because the games were going to be over far too quickly. Meanwhile, if you drafted, say, M14, you might not realize off the bat that Opportunity is basically a bomb, right? That card is just deck-definingly good, and you should always basically be blue so that you can play it, and that you were meant to be playing slower decks that were trying to grind out advantage, and being able to draw 4 cards for 1 card was pretty good. Similarly, with Rise of the Eldrazi, you kind of needed to pick up that ramping into big stuff. Playing Battlecruiser Magic was what you wanted to do, and that it really wasn't that much about early game aggression. And if you were playing Innistrad, there were a variety of synergies there. It's a very interesting format. But you were still looking generally to do something a little bit on the slower or mid-range side. Certainly you weren't trying to do what you were trying to do in Zendikar or Gatecrash, which is just play a lot of 2-drops and win. And so how you evaluate cards and how you look at a format, in large part has to be viewed through the lens of how fast is the format, how slow is the format, right? Because that's sort of something that defines the relative power level of cards as they sit on the mana curve, right? A very, very powerful card that costs 6 mana might not be very powerful in a format that's very fast, whereas a very powerful, 2-drop might not be that good in a format that's more about, playing slow, eking out a card advantage. If that 2-drop doesn't give you that card advantage, doesn't get you, closer to winning the end game, then it might not really be the basis of a very strong and successful archetype in the format. So I want to talk about past formats and then talk about Modern Masters, kind of use the past formats as a launching point. So what is it that makes a format fast? Let me try and get to the point. A lot of it, of course, is mechanics. The mechanics that they put in the set often define how good attacking versus blocking is going to be. So, for example, in Zendikar, one of the big mechanics was landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, I'll use Plate of Geopede as an example. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Plate of Geopede gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Well, you can't play lands at instant speed. You play lands at sorcery speed, unless you have some sort of trick like Harrow that allows you to put lands into play at instant speed. Generally speaking, Plate of Geopede could be a 3/3 first striker on your turn, and would be a 1/1 first striker when it wasn't your turn. And there's a very big difference between those two creatures, right? A 1/1 first strike is not really worth 2 mana. A 3/3 first strike is worth more than 2 mana. I would pay 3 mana easily for that. And you often got into these scenarios where if you and your opponent were staring across at each other and both you had a Plate of Geopede, you both were attacking with your Plate of Geopede. Neither one of you could profitably block because you were always incentivized to have combat when it was your turn. And if you're going to have combat when it's your turn, you have to be attacking, right? And they have to be blocking. So landfall as a mechanic was a very, very aggressive mechanic. And given the strength of the cards that use that mechanic, like Plate of Geopede, like Step Links, you often drafted decks that were very fast, very aggressive, typically wanted to play black-red, where a lot of the good, fast, aggressive creatures were, and try and close out games very quickly. And a lot of the cards that looked like they might be good were just too slow to use in the format. Similarly, some things like simply the power and toughness of a creature, right, can make a difference. In M12, for example, Stormfront Pegasus, a 2/1 flying for 2. Pretty simple, comparable to, say, Welkin Turn from Zendikar. A 2 attack evasive creature, of which there were tons in Zendikar, has a big impact on the format, right? It means that you play this creature and then you practically have them on a 10-turn clock. If you just attacked with that one creature again and again and again, 10 turns later they'd be dead. They'd have to find a way to block it. They'd have to find a way to do something. Evasive creatures, right, have benefits when they attack, basically. If it's Intimidate or something of that sort, a Mountain Walk, a Land Walk ability, it favors attacking. Likewise, Haste often favors attacking. So Goblin Bushwhacker is an example that I brought up here. When Goblin Bushwhacker enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, creatures you control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. Well, you're playing this guy at sorcery speed. Again, you're buffing creatures while it's your turn, so you want to have combat on your turn, which means you want to be attacking, and you're giving haste, which is also something that encourages attacking, right? So there's a lot of mechanics, whether it was Battalion in Gatecrash, or Blood Rush, or Bloodthirst in Magic 2012. There are a lot of mechanics that really incentivize dealing damage to your opponent, attacking, so on and so forth. Also, some cards in a format, they might give advantages, right? They might be very strong cards just neutrally, right? For both attacking and blocking or whatever. They might have an effect that's just simply good and limited. But then something is added on to that, which is specifically good for attacking. So, for example, Mugging in Gatecrash. Mugging is a great card. It's a sorcery speed shock, so I guess great might be a little bit of an exaggeration. But at common, 1 red, deal 2 damage is pretty good. To add on the text, that creature can't block this turn, is a pretty big deal, because then this becomes more than just a sorcery speed shock. This becomes a way to get past big creatures that your opponent was hoping to use to stabilize, right? Likewise, Hideous End. Hideous End is great. It's instant speed, destroy target non-black creature. adding its controller loses 2 life makes it more of a burn card as well, makes it more of an aggressive card. So sometimes you have mechanics that really support attacking, make you much stronger when you're on offense or when it's during your turn. And sometimes you have just cards that also, they're strong, very strong limited cards, and then they have something added to it that favors a more aggressive strategy rather than a more defensive strategy. Conversely, if we look at, say, the slower formats that I talked about, you have a lot of mechanics that work the other way. So, for example, Defender. Overgrown Battlements was a great card in Rise of the Eldrazi because, one, it ramps, which is an important thing. But two, it was a card that didn't favor aggressive strategies, right? This is a card that's very much defensive, very much survive until you can play big things, and it's pretty good for what it does, right? Similarly, we have cards like Deadly Recluse, right? Reach is more of a defensive mechanic than say, flying, right? And Death Touch itself is usually a pretty defensive mechanic because as the blocker, you get to choose how blocks are set up, and that means you can put your Deadly Recluse in front of whatever their biggest creature is. Whereas if you were attacking with your Deadly Recluse, for one, it only has 1 attack, 2 toughness. But even if it was a 2/1, right, you still wouldn't get the benefit of the Death Touch because your opponent would get to decide what creature he's going to trade with it, right? The Death Touch might not even be relevant after blocks are decided. Similarly, to some extent, Flash is more of a defensive thing. To be able to play stuff as a surprise, and particularly surprise, before blocks are declared, can really discourage attacking and doesn't have that much of an advantage in an offensive sense. So Ambush Viper is a great example. It has both Flash and Death Touch. This is a card that comes in and eats your opponent's biggest creature. It can't do that on offense, right? This is essentially a green Doomblade against attacking creatures, right? Deadly Recluse is like that, but not at instant speed usually. Very strong, right? Some creatures, some of your 2-drops are just good on defense and don't do a whole lot on offense. Angelic Wall is a great example. 0/4 defending flyer, decent. Lone Missionary, right? When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. Gaining 4 life is not really interesting for an aggressive strategy because you're more concerned about killing your opponent than gaining life for yourself. But a 2/1 for 2 mana isn't that bad, and this effect really discourages a lot of the aggressive strategies out there. And then things like Seacoast Drake, right? A 1/3 flyer is not a great attacker, but a 1/3 flyer shuts down Stormfront Pegasi all day, right? And then you might see cards that offer decent incremental advantage, right? And incremental advantage is a sort of thing that you're going to want to see in control strategies and not really something in aggressive strategies, right? And so cards like Halimar Wave Watch, right? Or Think Twice, things that let you use your mana to get card advantage on your opponent or buff up a creature. These things can be very strong. So we saw a lot of creatures, a lot of commons is what I'm emphasizing here in these 2 sets of cards. We saw a lot of commons in both sets that kind of showcased why aggressive strategies were good in these sets, and defensive, controlling, more card advantage strategies were better in the other sets. We see strong ramp. We see mechanics that are good on defense. We see strong sources of incremental advantage, right? We see effects that gain you life. We see, toughness being larger than power. Whereas on the other end, we see evasion abilities. We see mechanics that distinctly favor attacking, like Haste or Battalion or Landfall or Blood Rush. We see strong cards that have, synergies with an aggressive strategy. And so these are a lot of sort of differences between what the early game of an aggressive format looks like and what the early game of a less aggressive format looks like. Similarly, when you look at sort of later cards, and later I'm deciding is basically 3 to 5 mana, you see it's kind of the same story. You see mechanics that really favor aggressors, and you see on the other end more defensive strategies, more incremental advantage strategies, stuff like that being supported in the more defensive format. So if we look at the aggressive stuff, we see things like Core Hookmaster, right? Tapping down opponent's creatures is good because then you get to attack in. We see evasion in the form of, say, Intimidate with Blade Tuskboar. This is a great way to have reach when you were playing in Zendikar, right? If your opponent wasn't playing red, this creature could just be a lightning bolt to the face, because if they didn't have removal for it, that's what it would do to him next turn. We see things like Bloodthirst, Blood Rush, Landfall, particular things like a 3/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying. So it has evasion, it's a bad blocker, and it has much larger power than toughness. Yeah, stuff like this is what favors an aggressive format. Whereas if we look at the defensive formats, a lot of these cards are built around providing incremental advantage or have, power and toughness that very much favors blocking. Seagate Oracle is a great card, for example, Rise of the Eldrazi. This is very playable in a lot of formats. I guess mainly just Pauper, but it's a 1/3, and it offers incremental advantage, right? Ghoul Raiser, it's a 2/2, offers incremental advantage. Advocate of the Beast, 2/3, that offers incremental advantage over time, right? We see creatures with Defender, creatures with lots of toughness, no attack. We see ways of closing out the game with Defenders, even, with Vent Sentinel. So you have big differences between what you're trying to do at all the mana stages of the mana curve, right? In the aggressive formats, you're still having these powerful effects at the higher mana costs that favor attacking. And in the more defensive formats, you're finding ways to shut down a lot of those aggressive creatures, right? Through stuff through good blockers, or you're finding ways to out card advantage your opponent, right? With Seagate Oracles, Ghoul Raisers, Archaeomancers, etc. Or just pile up +1/+1 counters on something over time. So what about Modern Masters 2017? How does it shake up? Is the format looking to be slow, fast? What do the commons look like? And so I kind of looked at a lot of the commons and said, well, how does it break down? What are we looking at in terms of speed of the format? And my judgment of it is that we're looking at probably a more defensive format, and for a number of reasons. The first reason is the mana base. I've included Arcane Sanctums here, even though this is sort of a discussion of commons, but I just wanted to throw them in because this is where I was going to put the discussion about mana base. Guild Gates, lands that come into play tapped, are generally lands that favor a less aggressive strategy, right? They're lands, anything that allows you to mana fix but costs you tempo in doing so, generally is something that favors the more control game, right? Because if you want to take advantage of this mana fixing as an aggressive strategy, well, losing that tempo, having the land come into play tapped, is a big blow to you because you're looking to play a lot of stuff early on. That way you can kill your opponent before they get running. The tap lands don't really favor an aggressive format. This isn't the biggest thing, of course. Zendikar had tap lands. Guild Gates, of course, were in Gatecrash as well. But having mana fixing that's of this quality, but having it come at the cost of tempo, is something that's going to, of course, discourage strategies based on having a lot of tempo. Similarly, we see a lot of cards, some of them exactly from what we had seen before, we see a lot of cards that favor defense, right? In terms of early drops, I have Kraken Hatchling, 0/4 wall for 1. We have Mana Dorks, which aren't typically aggressive. They're more of a ramped sort of strategy. We have things like Lone Missionary, gaining you life. We have card advantage, right? We have more ramp. And then one of the things in particular that really defines whether or not control strategies can work is whether or not they have a lot of ways to cheaply interact with opponents' creatures and remove them. To some extent, removal can be used in an aggressive fashion. If you're able to deal damage both to the face and to creatures, then it's not necessarily something that slows down a format because it gives you reach, right? It gives you the ability after they've killed off your creatures to still lightning bolt them to the face and win the game. But we see a lot of removal at lower rarities. I don't think Is It Charm actually belongs here. I think this is still an uncommon at. I think it is. I'm gonna take it out. Anyways, either way, we see things like Agony Warp, Ground Assault, Pitfall Trap. We see good removal at the common slot that doesn't go face, right? Ground Assault targets creatures. Pitfall Trap targets attacking creatures. Agony Warp is a combat trick. Usually you use it to blank the attack of a creature, but also kill another one. So we see a lot of good removal at common. We're going to see even more of it at uncommon. Seal of Doom, Cower and Fear are also here. And we also, again, see a lot of the incremental card advantage from before. So Forbidden Alchemy is a pretty good card overall. Right, this is the sort of thing that will give you a lot of advantage over time. Seagate Oracle, same story. Soul Manipulation, countering creature spells and returning creature cards to your hand. Pretty decent. We see more removal. Augur Spree, more card advantage. Mystical Teachings, more removal and card advantage with Grasp of Phantoms. And Aether Toe, right, both of which can basically be 2-for-1s if you have sort of the right setup. And we see more defensive creatures, right? We see Centaur Healer, right? A 3/3 for 3 is a decent deal. Gaining 3 life, not relevant to an aggressive strategy, relevant to a defensive strategy. Ogre Jailbreaker. I mean, it's likely even in an aggressive strategy you might be able to get a gate, but if you don't have your gate, the fact that this guy is a defender in a defensive strategy is fine. You're fine letting him turn on much later. If you're in the aggressive strategy, playing this guy and not being able to attack with him is a pretty bad deal. Penumbra Spider, stuff like this, is also really strong. 2/4 Reach. Again, more toughness than power, and Reach, which is meant to kind of counteract a lot of the evasion. So we see a lot of removal. We see a lot of good, solid card advantage cards. We see a mana base that comes into play tapped. We see ramp. We see, a bunch of stuff that's saying this is going to be a slower format. Now, what do we see on the other side of things for sort of the faster format? And when I say faster format, I'm also going to say that if 2-drops are much more powerful than 4-drops, then you're going to have sort of a shift towards more early game being important, right? If 2-drops are very powerful, people are going to want to draft a lot of 2-drops, and not having 2-drops could be very costly because, if you wait to play your cards until turn 4, because that's when you've amassed a lot of your cards, you're not going to have the power level to stabilize, right? The 2-drops are still going to be very strong, and your 4-drops relative to them aren't going to be strong enough to win you the game, and you're not going to get there. So I've also put in here, if there's just solid 2-drops, I'm going to count them as aggressive cards. And so some of these don't really seem like aggressive cards, but some of them, they still kind of are because they're cheap, and they're big for their size. But I guess part of what I'm wanting to say is that I'm kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here when it comes to finding solid aggressive cards at common. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Madcap Skills is an aggressive card. Giving Menace and +3/+0 is, really something that says, for one, I'm an enchantment aura, so I don't care about card advantage, but 2, I really am interested in attacking. And that's what Madcap Skills was used for in Gatecrash, and it's what it'll be used for in this format, and you'll just want to be able to put it on a creature when your opponent doesn't have Agony Warp mana out, or Pitfall Trap mana out, or Seal of Doom out, or can kill your creature with Cower and Fear, or do any of the removal that we just talked about earlier. You don't want to put Madcap Skills on something and then they Augur Spree it, and whoops, you just got 2-for-1. But still, an aggressive card, even if, again, a lot of these defensive cards seem to trump it. We see things like Dregscape Zombie, right? Unearth is an aggressive mechanic. When you unearth a creature, you're going to attack with it. So all these unearthed creatures are pretty good for an aggressive strategy. We see things like basically Trumpet Blast with Dynacharge here. This is a good aggressive card, right? Giving your creatures +2/+0 until end of turn is usually more relevant when you are attacking, right? Because you want to have a lot of creatures, you just want to kill them. Bone Splinters, I'm going to count it as an aggressive card. It's removal, and so normally you'd think removal is more of a defensive strategy, but here you're sacrificing a creature to get this removal effect. And in that scenario, you often want to have cheap creatures, right? This is a card that makes your 2-drops better, because later in the game, you'll be able to sacrifice them to kill off your opponent's 4-drop, 5-drop, 6-drop. So Bone Splinters is not really a card advantage card, and because it requires you to have a board state, and ideally a board state with small creatures, right, cheap creatures, I'm counting this as an aggressive card. This is something you use to trade off one of your tokens or one of your 2-drops for your opponent's 4-drop and hammer your way through with more damage, right? This is definitely not about card advantage because you're losing a creature. This is about clearing the board for your guys to go through. We see a decent number of 2-drops. Mog Flunkies, I'm going to count, is a pretty good 2-drop. I remember playing this guy a lot in M13, and he's solid. A 3/3 for 2 mana is good. Likewise, Call of the Conclave, same story. It's a 3/3 for 2 mana. Spike Jester, Haste, again, a mechanic that you care about. Burning Tree Emissary, a 2/2 for 2 mana isn't super exciting, but the tempo that it offers with getting you back your mana is pretty important. We see some mechanics that really favor aggression, right? Blood Rush that we saw before with Gate Crash is here. Giant Baiting is aggressive, creating these tokens that are exiled at the beginning of the next instep, of course, is a very aggressive strategy. Hungry Spriggan is practically the definition of an aggressive mechanic. Whenever it attacks, it gets +3/+3 until end of turn, so it's when you're on offense, a 4/4 Trampler. I'm going to count Tandem Lookout in here as well. Any card that requires you to connect with your opponent to get the advantage is kind of like an aggressive card, right? It's something that at least values you getting on the board, whether you're the person facing off against the Tandem Lookout or whether you're the person with the Tandem Lookout. You need creatures on the board. You need to be playing something relatively early to get advantage of this. Core Hookmaster, again, this is a classic aggressive card from Zendikar, tapping down your opponent, that way you can get through. And then we see some of the other stuff like Chandra's Outrage, right? Chandra's Outrage is just a solid removal spell, and it has the kicker of deal 2 damage to that creature's controller. So this is a little bit like Hideous End from Zendikar in the previous set of cards that I showed, right? It's good removal, or decent removal. I mean, 4 damage, 4 mana, that's fair. Adding the 2 damage to a creature's controller is relevant in a strategy where you're very quickly trying to get their life total down. Not as relevant in a strategy where you're just trying to win through card advantage. Scourge Devil, Skylight Legionnaire. Some haste creatures, some unearthed creatures, some attacking creatures get this and that, right? There's stuff you can do here, but again, there's more things going on in the defensive slots, right? There's more things that, like removal, that can only be pointed at creatures that I think is really dominating the discussion. There's not as much going on here. And one of the big things that I think makes this format a slower format is that it is not necessarily the commons here, although commons are extremely important to defining a format. It is signets. So signets are one of the most powerful things you can do in a limited format usually. This is true of a lot of the cubes that are run on MTGO, and I think it's going to be true of Modern Masters. These are 2 mana rocks, essentially. They're so good that basically they haven't brought them back in limited environments for a very long time, except in environments where there's pretty good power level. We've seen a lot of things like banners from Khans of Tarkir. We've seen the Clue Stones from our sort of return to Ravnica. We've seen a lot of worse stuff. The signets are the good stuff. And the signets, if signets are at uncommon, and there's 10 of them, right? So it's not out of the ordinary that you could get a signet in your deck, right? These aren't at rare, and it's not like there's only a few of them around at the uncommon slot. There's 10 signets in this set. A lot of people are going to be able to get a signet, and the signet is almost always going to be one of the most powerful things you can do on turn 2. And so we start asking the question, well, if signets are the most powerful thing we can do on turn 2, right, then what do we have on turn 4 that's really strong, right? Maybe we play signets, but then we follow up the signets by playing more 2-drops, and we're still kind of an aggressive format. But if there's good stuff to be playing in the 4-drop slot, then a lot of games are going to be decided not by some guy playing a 2-drop into a 3-drop into a 4-drop and just swinging and winning. The guy who plays signet first and then plays a 4-drop, if that 4-drop is impactful enough, is going to win a lot more of these games. So here I have a lot of the commons at the 4-drop slot. And again, I think the story is that a lot of these are better in more controlling card advantage strategies and not as good in the aggressive strategies. Things like Grasp of Phantoms, Mystical Teachings, Rewind, Aether Toe, Grisly Spectacle. We have a lot of good removal, effectively. Good counter spells, good card advantage good stuff for dealing with these aggressive strategies, right? If some guy plays a 2-drop, and then plays a 3-drop, and I respond by turn 3 playing a Mist Raven and bouncing his 3-drop, his tempo strategy is starting to fall apart. My Mist Raven can trade with his 2-drop. He has to replay his 3-drop, and now I'm on maybe 4 or 5 mana, and he's only done a little bit of damage to me, and I'm off to the races, right? The Signet powered me out to a pretty good start. If I'm playing things like Penumbra Spider, right, it's going to be difficult for my opponent to get through this Penumbra Spider with what he's played on turn 2 or turn 3, right? Same thing with Ogre Jailbreaker. If I can be removing his creatures with Aether Toe, I mean, there's all sorts of things I can do here at common for 4 mana, and not a lot of them are aggressive. Mist Raven can be kind of aggressive. You bounce something and get a tempo advantage from your opponent. But it itself is not, for 4 mana, if I'm only putting out 2 power worth of toughness, it's not the most aggressive of things, right? I think this is going to be more valuable on sort of defense. And the fact that it's a blue creature, which doesn't really support aggressive strategies, also suggests it's going to be better as in the defensive strategies, right? Just because of the way the archetypes are set up. Falkenrath Noble, I'm going to say, is also kind of iffy in terms of whether or not it's aggressive or defensive. If it only read target player loses 1 life, then it would definitely be aggressive. But the fact that you gain life as well is something that bends it more towards a defensive strategy. Really, there aren't a whole lot of cards here that are just purely aggressive at common in the 4-drop slot. Battle Rattle Shaman is pretty good for this, right? Again, adding more power than toughness is usually something that benefits aggressive strategies. Rubble Belt Maka has Blood Rush, right? It's kind of meant to be played in this could be the top of your curve in an aggressive strategy. Chandra's Outrage, again, we talked about that earlier. But by and large, you're looking at a lot of decent removal, and you're looking at counter spells, card advantage, defensive creatures. What you're seeing at the 4-drop slot here really is about stabilizing against aggressive decks and not really so much about pushing through the final points, right? The exception is the red cards, but everyone else at the 4-drop slot is basically doing a defensive strategy. And at the uncommons, we don't see that much of a difference either. We see a lot of defensive stuff going on and not as much aggressive stuff going on. So I'll review sort of the aggressive stuff first. Teleportal is a great aggressive card, right? This is a card that is excellent for getting through with your final points of damage. This is sort of a finisher. You overload it for 5. You swing in with all your guys. Tattermunge Witch, decent. I mean, again, each blocked creature gets +1/+0, so this is something that specifically benefits attackers. Molten Rain, right? This is like one of these good effects that has the added bonus of doing something that synergizes with an aggressive strategy. Destroying a target land is pretty good. I mean, Stone Rain's a solid card and limited, I would say, especially in a format that cares so much about mana fixing. And dealing 2 damage to the controller as a kicker is a good deal. Wayfaring Temple, when it connects with the opponent, it populates, so you want to be attacking with it. Skurzad Cultist is basically reach, right? It's 2 damage to target creature or player, so it lets you take a lot of your cheap creatures that you use to attack early on and chuck them in your opponent's face or change combat mass, stuff like that. Carnage Gladiator, very aggressive creature. Gorkline Rampager, very aggressive creature. Gruul Warchant, very aggressive, attacking creatures, get +1/+0 and an evasive ability. Bronzebeak Moa, again, creatures are coming into the battlefield under your control, usually during your turn. So this is, a 5/5 on offense and a 2/2 on defense. I'm even putting Moroi in here because at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life. This card itself puts you on a 20-turn clock. That, anything that puts anybody on a clock, whether it's you or your opponent, is something that really speeds up a format. So, of course, even though this is a card that's going to fit more into the defensive strategies, the defensive strategies having this card is kind of a good thing for you if you're one of the aggressive strategies because their life total might matter. Things like Pyrewild Shaman, right? Blood Rush as an ability is really good. And it's also whenever 1 or more of your creatures deal combat damage to a player, so you want to be attacking to use the other part of it. right? We see a decent number of aggressive things, and I'm also throwing in Ancient Grudge as a counter to Signets, which are sort of the defensive choice of 2-drop. This is a pretty good artifact removal spell. And I'm also counting Intangible Virtue because it's just a very solid 2-drop in my opinion. Not really an aggressive card, but again, anything that's strong at lower mana cost, I think is leaning you more towards an aggressive strategy than a defensive one, though this one is kind of more about building up a big board of tokens. So we see some aggressive cards here, and again, similar theme. We're seeing most of them in red of some sort. Ancient Grudge, Teleportal, Tattermunch Witch, Pyrewild Shaman, Molten Rain, Skursdag Cultist, Carnage Gladiator, Gorgclam Rampager, Gruul Warchant. A lot of red aggressive stuff, but not a lot else going on in the other colors, really, that supports that aggressive strategy. And if we look at the defensive cards, we see things like Pyroclasm. Having a board sweeper, or effectively a board sweeper against decks that are trying to go wide and stuff at uncommon, is kind of rough to aggressive strategies. Likewise, a lot of removal is pretty good. Terminate, cheap stuff like this isn't very good for you. Lingering Souls, this is another one of these things, a card about incremental advantage, right? This is about sort of getting 4/1/1s for 5 mana over time. Compulsive Research, more incremental advantage. This is a very good card, right? Draw 3 cards, then discard a land is really good. I mean, this is almost effectively draw 3 cards because sometimes you don't care about having that extra land. We see Walls, right? Creatures with Defender. We see things like Lifelink. We see Thornscape Battlemage. You kind of want to kick him to get value out of him, so he's more just like a solid higher up drop. Basically, this is a card that gets value the more mana you have. So I'm kind of putting it here. I'm not going to say this is a really strong push one way or the other, but we see so many other effects, right? 3 color strategies that wanted a lot of mana fixing, they're getting solid cards. They're getting Sprouting Thrynax, Woolly Thokdar, Sidraxis Spectre, Rox Warmonk. A lot of these guys are pretty defensive, right? Sprouting Thrynax gives you a lot of chump blockers. Rox Warmonk has lifelink. Sidraxis Spectre, even that, is to some extent about incremental advantage, about making your opponent discard cards, right? This is kind of like Thornscape Battlemage, not necessarily a defensive card. But again, 3 colors is hard for an aggressive deck to achieve, especially when the cost of mana fixing is having your lands come into play tapped. So seeing good 3-color cards, strong 3-color cards, of which I'm going to count Sidraxis Spectre, is kind of rough if you are an aggressive deck, because to get access to them, you have to accept losses to tempo, which is something that goes against your game plan. Soul Manipulation. I had this in the common slot as well, so I've messed something up. If this is an uncommon, then it belongs here, and it didn't belong in the other one. Sin Collector, again, incremental advantage. Golgari Germination, incremental advantage. Putrefy, removal. Unflinching Courage. The trample is kind of aggressive, but the lifelink part is really not. And we see really strong cards like Master Splicer, right, which is very much about bouncing and replaying this and getting more golems. And it's not really about attacking in a big way, right? This is just a very solid 4-drop, which favors a slower strategy. Harmonize, Soul Ransom, other really strong 4-drops, things with incremental advantage, right? We're seeing a lot of stuff at Uncommon that supports getting to 4 mana and getting mana fixing, right? A lot of really strong 3-color cards, 4/4 flyers for 4 mana, 3/4 lifelinkers for 3 mana. So sticking to a strategy of I'm going to play close to mono red and go at my opponent's face, you're giving up a lot, right? You're giving up a lot of really strong multicolor cards. You're giving up a lot of that really solid incremental advantage. You're giving up a lot of the removal even. In fact, you hear at the uncommon slot, the only removal you have is something that you really don't want to have, which is Pyroclasm in mono red. Terminate could work to your favor, but other than that, this is not so terribly good. So we see lots of cards that are very strong in more controlling shells, and not a lot of cards that are strong in the other shells. So I want to make this video to kind of give a first impression of the set and what archetypes I think are going to be strong, and of course what colors we can see looking at this sort of stuff. are going to be favoring the aggressive strategies and which ones are going to be favoring the more defensive controlling strategies. And this will be sort of a launching point into discussing the archetypes. But overall, I would say, with the presence of signets in the set, with this huge quantity of removal that's available in the set, I mean, we're talking about Agony Warp, Ground Assault, Pitfall Trap, we're talking about Grasp of Phantoms, Aether Toe, we're talking about, in the uncommon slot, Soul Ransom, we're talking about Soul Manipulation to some extent, Terminate, Pyroclasm, right? There's a lot of really good removal in this set. There's a lot of defensive creatures or creatures that are built around incremental advantage, things that have lifelink, things that have defender, things that provide a lot of chump blockers, a lot of stuff that draws you cards, lets you search through your deck for cards, right? And the pure aggression stuff is a little bit on the lacking side. I think that we're going to see red, of course, is a very aggressive color because a lot of cards here. We've seen a lot of aggressive cards in support of red. But if red is the only real aggressive color and all the rest of them are kind of doing something else, unless they're specifically paired with red, I think it's going to be a slower, more defensive format. And I think you're going to want to draft accordingly, valuing 4 drops more, valuing that higher stuff more, and of course, treating signets as they deserve to be treated, which is some of the most powerful things you can do in a limited format. So that's sort of my first impressions. Hopefully we'll form a good starting point when I discuss the archetypes of the set, and sort of what cards I'm looking for in each of those archetypes, and sort of my rating of the cards going forward. But good baseline to have. I think we're looking at a less aggressive set, one that allows you to play a more controlling card advantage strategy in most of your games, and won't punish you too hard for taking big bombs and big card advantage cards, even if they don't do that much for you in the early game. All right, that's all.